Let's talk about the China Seas. This map is part of a 1519 nautical atlas. It is a set of 6 separate parchment folios with 8 total maps. Since the end of the 19th century, it's been known as the Miller Atlas. And now let's go to the agenda. First will be the characters involved. Next, we'll move on to my premise. And then we'll do a little bit of background, including talking about the Treaty of Tordesillas. We'll get a little bit of information about Portugal and China. And then we'll move to the maps themselves. The South China Seas Side 1, which is Verso, and South China Seas Side 2, which is referred to as Recto. Finally, we'll get to the summary and conclusion, and then you'll be able to see my bibliography. My premise is that the Miller Atlas was not made for nautical, governing, or military purposes. It was made to bring joy to the owner, either Queen Eleanor, also known as Leonor, of Portugal, or whoever is King of France at the time the atlas was finished, which happened to be Francis I. Let's see who gets it. These are most of the characters involved with the making of the maps. First of all, we have Ferdinand and Isabella, King and Queen of Spain, during the time that the Treaty of Tordesillas was proposed and signed. Alexander VI, who was Pope at the time and was mediator between the King and Queen of Spain and the King of Portugal, John II. Next, you have Manuel I, who was King of Portugal after the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed and received the most benefit from it. Ferdinand Magellan, of course, was the Portuguese explorer who was working for Spain at that time and was wanting to go west to see if he could circle the entire earth. Charles V, King of Spain, after Ferdinand and Isabella. Then we have Zhengde, 11th Emperor of the Ming Dynasty. And finally, the lovely Eleanor, Queen of Portugal. You might have noticed that King Francis I is not mentioned or shown here. The maps were intended, potentially, for whomever was King of France at that time. And I only had 8 perfect slots for the images. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494. So what was going on at the latter part of the 15th century? Well, Spain and Portugal were finding new worlds. They were also finding new ways of getting to known parts of the world, and they wanted to know who gets what lands without bloodshed, especially if they found lands claimed by the other. Ferdinand and Isabella sought the help of the Pope as mediator to keep the new worlds discovered by Christopher Columbus. With the Pope's help, they set a boundary line 370 leagues, or nearly 1,200 miles, west of the Cape Verde Islands. You can see those on the map, and all non-Christian lands discovered west of this demarcation line would equal Spain's property. All non-Christian lands discovered east of the line were Portugal's property. You can see on the far right of the map the Strait of Malacca. This is important, please remember it. So what happens when you go west from Spain and you just keep going? Here is a timeline of pertinent events dealing with the creation of the maps. You can see what happens here in the timeline, and if you want to look more closely at it, please pause the video. You will see 1494, the treaty was signed between John II and Ferdinand and Isabella. 4 years after the treaty, 1498, da Gama finds a waterway to India. High hopes for riches there. In 1511, 13 years after da Gama's voyage, Manuel sends an armada of ships and takes Malacca, which is the door from the west to the Spice Islands. The next 10 years are very important, and please pay more attention to this area. In 1517, Portuguese went further east and started trading with China. More high hopes for riches. They love the Treaty of Tordesillas. Between the years of 1517 and 1521 is the year that both Emperor Zhengde and Manuel I die, this atlas was started and seemingly abandoned in 1519, and then its whereabouts for a while afterwards is unknown. It makes me wonder why was it abandoned and who had it after 1521. Where and why did Portugal go? This is part 1. First of all, what is in a name? Well, we've got Malacca, which is also known as Milaka. It's a state, a city, a strait, a river, and a port in Malaysia. If you control Malacca, then you've controlled the alternative path to the east, alternative to the land route from Europe to Asia, which the Ottoman Empire controlled, and Venice controlled the ancient waterways to the east. Central to shipping among China, India, and the west was the Strait of Malacca. They also thought, the Portuguese that is, build a fort and get paid, because anyone who was China-bound in maritime trade from India, Persia, and the Arabian Peninsula on the ancient waterways must either pass through the Strait of Malacca, or they have to travel much farther south in very dangerous waters with monsoons and pirates. Controlling Malacca, you can have a near monopoly of Chinese goods and spices going west, as well as a hand in all of the trades that went east. Here is an interesting quote from the first Portuguese ambassador to China, Tomé Pich. Those who are to be seen in Malacca are not very truthful and steal. That is, the common people. It's rather condescending, and it was an excuse to conquer these people. After all, the Portuguese needed to save all of these heathens. Okay, part 2 of where and why did Portugal go, and also part 2 of what is in a name. The Moluccas, or the Moluccas, or Maluku, Maluku, Moluccas. All of those are names for the Spice Islands. Why did Portugal want to go there? Wealth, money, power, more heathens to convert, more proof that Portugal was the most powerful nation on earth and favored of God. There were precious metals and stones, and especially spices. So what did Portugal want? Well, they wanted all of the East, not just the Spice Islands. They wanted a monopoly of all trade going east from Europe, the Arabian Peninsula, India, and all points west of the Far East. They wanted a monopoly. They decided they would use the oceans to move east and conquer as they went. Their first stop, Goa, India. And they thought, once we conquer them, all of its regions will give up their riches. Spain was given precious metals in the Americas, but we, Portugal, are entitled to all the treasures from the mysterious East. Plus, we get Brazil. Another quote from Tome Piche: China are made out to be great, riches, pomp, in both the land and people, and other tales which it would be easier to believe as true of our Portugal than of China. Jealous much? The Portuguese seemed to see the East as a quick and easy way to amass wealth and therefore power. They wanted to keep this as their own monopoly. Whoever is Lord of Malacca has his hand on the throat of Venice. As far as from Malacca to China, all is in our power. Kind of speaks for itself. How do I like thee? Let me count the ways. The Chinese were neutral as to Portugal, but the Portuguese belligerence and arrogance made it so that there was no love between them, and eventually there was great animosity. Religion was not involved as a motive, but China felt superior to all other countries, morally, culturally, physically, and wanted to actually civilize the Portuguese barbarians. After all, they were just another group of barbarians who want some riches from the East. Fortunately for Portugal, Emperor Zhengde did not follow the strict adherence to isolationism that other Ming emperors did, and so he was more open to allowing foreigners into China's territories. So in 1517, Emperor Zhengde allowed trade with Portugal at Guangzhou only. Fortunately, all maritime trade with China went through Guangzhou. It's a very lively port. Portugal's public response is thank you. Secretly, however, they were saying, we go wherever we want and trade with whomever we choose. Now, with foreigners trading with China, tributes were expected. Portugal's response, okay, we can still make loads of money from this venture, and they were correct. Remember when I said that the belligerence and arrogance of the Portuguese caused animosity? Well, it did a lot more than that. There's more to this quote than what I put, but I felt this was graphic enough. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, it shows many potential reasons for the creation of these maps, and they include braggadocio, look at what I own, hedonism, beauty for its own sake, maintaining and expanding power, such as getting the King of France as an ally, or the Indians thought they could stop us, but now we control them, so the Chinese dare not oppose us, and we can be great trading partners as long as they recognize our superiority. Another reason could be monopoly on cartographic knowledge. This map gives our country the knowledge of how to get to the Spice Islands, to navigate amongst the maze of islands and dangerous conditions about which only we know. Religious motives. God has made it known that we are entitled to these lands, and to thank him, we need to convert the heathens to Catholicism. Governing is a natural. It's much easier to govern when one knows what they are governing. Land use and efficiency was the most efficient use of resources to help our citizens and our subjects. And overflowing coffers. We are the sole authority for maritime trade in the Indian Ocean, and we wish to extend our monopolistic powers to Southeast Asia. So who got the maps? So now we finally get to see the maps of this atlas about which we're discussing. You can see Folio 4 Verso, the front page, on the left, and Folio 4 Recto, which is simply the reverse side of Verso. It was entitled the 1519 Nautical Atlas, and as we know, it was later referred to as the Miller Atlas. When you look at the writing, the lettering on it, you can see the opulence of the manuscript, and the exuberant decoration and an abundance of gold and silver, as well as other very bright and wonderful colors. It suggests that it was intended to be a gift to some royal house, and as said earlier, perhaps to the King of France. Or maybe it was intended for Leonor, King Manuel's new young wife, who happens to be the sister of the Emperor Charles V. And that's the same Charles V in whose service Ferdinand Magellan had been working since 1518, preparing to sail around the world by heading west. Some say the map was made to bring pleasure and joy to their royal patron. I'm one of those people. Folio 4 Verso of the Miller Atlas. The China Sea with the Molucca Islands, also as we know is the Spice Islands. So let's get into the maps. Some vital statistics shown here is that it was drawn in 1519. It's from the Miller Atlas at the National Library of France, joint work of the celebrated cartographers Lopo Homem, Pedro Reinel, and Jorge Reinel, who were father and son. It was illustrated by Antonio de Holanda. The medium is ink on vellum, and it's painted on both sides. The size is about 16.5 inches by 23.25 inches. It shows towns, fortifications, forests, settlements, castles, mythical beasts, a couple of men, and the area going north to south is from the equator to the 47th parallel. Here we find the timeline of the location of the Miller Atlas. In 1519 it was started, and apparently it was finished, but it was incomplete. There's some debate here. Some, like myself, maintain that the atlas was taken by Lopo Holmes' cartographer's son, later giving it to his new employer. Some say Leonore took it and moved to France, where she eventually became queen. There seem to be no records of the map's whereabouts for about 320 years, and then all of a sudden, the atlas, not yet called the Miller Atlas, was sold to Visconde de Santarem. A year later, it was sold to Emmanuel Clement Miller, and after he died, his widow sold it to the National Library of France in 1897, where it is today. Verso. I wanted you to have a large image of the map so that maybe we can go through it and see some of the interesting things to be found there. First of all, notice the shadows which are drawn on most of the objects. The sun is in the west and it is beyond the meridian. There are 19 rivers, each have names and seem to be almost equally spaced apart, so it is likely that fresh water was not an issue for these people. A few of the islands are named, and there are several and various sized islands. The illustrations include castles, fortifications, unfortified rural settlements, towns, cities, regions, huts, and architectural structures, and other images drawn in perspective, including forests and fruit-growing vegetation. There's a depiction of a bird, a griffin in the upper left, and opposite the griffin, a dragon, two individuals diagonal from each other, and many hills, mountains, rivers, likely representing the topology to the best of the knowledge of the cartographers, as well as their imagination. Towns like the ones here can be found on other maps in the Miller Atlas. The colors are bold and conspicuous. There are various shades of brown, green, and blue. There's tan, red, gold. The gold is beautifully laid down to look like gold leaf. There's orange, pink, gray, and black. Interestingly, I see no Chinese architecture present. That would include Buddhist temples, monasteries, and pagodas. Maps of this era have at times used small red squares with 4 entrances to represent a city in Chinese style. We see none of those here. The shapes of the coastlines, especially with the islands, are quite detailed. There's a cartouche on each page, as well as rum lines, but no windroses. It appears that the rum lines were drawn first. There are no religious signs other than the cross on the Portuguese ship and the crescent. There are red banners with gold lettering that represent towns and regions. China is in the bottom left. I have no idea why. We are not certain the length of the east-west portion of this map, other than that this is from Ptolemy's Geography, the Magnus Sinus, which is the South China Seas. But at the top, we see the words India Extra, which likely indicates India Extragangum, which is India beyond the Ganges River. We see coconut and or date trees or other fruit-bearing trees, and that would indicate a hot and or tropical climate. There's no legend or other explanations, so the cartographers must have thought, 1, the material was known so well that explanations were unnecessary, or giving much information may have taken away from the beauty of the map, or since the map was incomplete, they just didn't get to it. Finally, it might be something else. Maybe too much of their imagination was used and they couldn't describe it. Who knows? So let's take an overall assessment of this side of the map. First, the cartouche. Translated, it says, "This is the great gulf of the Sea of China, in which there are large islands in which riches and merchandise of every kind is traded." Also, we can see Portugal's flag scattered about, which indicates Portuguese influence or control of certain regions or islands. The crescent flag or banner is of Islam, the Moors, Arabs, Ottoman Turks, many ships with the crescent. So who controls the seas here? There are horizontal delineating lines, as I call them. The 5 black lines are 5 of Ptolemy's 7 climates, and the 2 red ones are the equator and the Tropic of Cancer. All along the right side, we see latitudes enumerated from the equator to 47 degrees north. Also, there's only 1 Portuguese ship on the map, either the front or the back, and it's on the front here. Of myths and men. Bestiaries from the Middle Ages show that the griffin is a combination of the king of beasts and the king of birds and represents God. Next we have the serpent, of which the dragon is, and indicates the king of serpents, and that usually represents China. You can see the shoe style of both these gentlemen. The curled up pointed toe. Only the wealthiest males during the Mughal Empire in the early 16th century wore these. You can see the Moors' hats, generally only worn in the country, sometimes adorned with tufts of silk. And a genuine fez cap pointed at the top like a sugar loaf. And that's what you see here with their hats. Silk cloaks, the fancier, the more important the person. And these clothing represents Moors, Arabs, Ottoman Turks, and parts of India. So among the Chinese emperor's imports included parrots. This is one of the most beautifully drawn sections of the entire map. This bird appears twice in this area of the map, and it's an absolutely beautiful job of creating this bird. Although it's quite beautiful, it is not naturally found in China. Rather, it can be found on the east coast of Australia. Now we're going to look at the western rivers, regions, and towns on this part of the map. So going from the top to the bottom, and this is not all inclusive, it appears that the architecture in some of the cities and towns are meant to look familiar and others are possibly exotic and new. The mountains at the top are so high that they leave the page. Forests are strewn about almost by random. A splendid castle made of light bricks and mortar or stones in Maniol, possibly a kingdom at which royalty or leaders live, has red clay roofs which are reminiscent of Indian architecture. Also, there are rum lines for this section of the map that converge or possibly start from the center of this area. Interestingly, in the 16th century with Portuguese architecture, the royal palace is atop the most prominent hill. And if you look at this, this is the most beautiful set of mountains on the entire map right at this point. Next, the brown huts look like they are made with compacted earth and candiu, possibly for the common folks, maybe even ruled by Maniol, and they are in a flatter area where farming likely occurred, possibly Christians and protected by the griffin, which is God. The town of Ardva is next, near to what appear to be coconut trees. The architecture appears to be better technology than in Candiu. A crescent banner may indicate an Islamic region. Next, the Ziaz region has higher quality housing than Candiu and is highly organized, and it's a larger city from the number of houses found there. Also, the structures in the Ziaz region look similar to the image on the right of ancient Turkish buildings. And the island that is named just south of the Tropic of Cancer on a plain banner is Mokolor Islands. Do not confuse these with the Moluccas. Part 2 of the Western Rivers, Regions, and Towns. First is Miniatsis. This appears to be a large wall with earth heaped around the base of the towers. It's not exactly like the Great Wall of China, but possibly the artist had little knowledge of what the wall looked like, and it might be represented here. These look to be defensive towers near a dense forest. Next, the Kundala region with the crescent banner or flag, and near a river named Arabs. This looks like a very advanced and powerful city with fortifications. If you look, only one entrance on the far left tower. There are similarities with this city and its architecture to the images at the bottom of the slide. This architecture in this region seems to me to be late Gothic or maybe Manueline, of course named after King Manuel I of Portugal, and that can be seen in image A of the Belém Tower. My research does not indicate why China was drawn in the bottom southwest corner, and as you can see, there is no architecture on the islands, probably because there are too many of them and they are too small. Now for the eastern rivers, regions, and towns. These cities are similar to the ones on the west side, with some minor architectural exceptions. At the top, we see what looks to be a dwarf date tree or other fruit-bearing palm along a lake, possibly an oasis. As there is no vegetation behind this plant and the ground looks barren, this might be a desert, hence the oasis. The huts in the town of Masela seem to be like the ones in the town of Candiu, except that these do not have any ground-level doorways, which simply indicates that we can't see the openings and therefore they do not face south. This is clearly not Chinese architecture, as the Chinese prefer to have main entrances face south. The city of Kobar is being protected by the dragon, which of course is China. It may be that this little valley is a Chinese protectorate. The architecture is simple and all doors face south. Zacatate looks like another fort, but with residences, possibly for a brigade of soldiers. Possibly this area is in dispute. Next we have Corinta, or Corinth. The city encircles a tall tower between two rocky hills and probably is very secure from enemies. It appears to have used more advanced civil planning and engineering in this city. Also, it has the most number of structures, 23 of them, on the map, and it's in such a compact area, so that leads me to believe that it is a large, densely packed city. Red tile roofs again, reminiscent of what has been used in India. Cities generally have more structures on this side of the map, and they seem denser. Eastern Rivers, Regions, and Towns, Part 2. The Olor region is unlike any of the other regions with its blue rounded roofs and its multi-story structures. It appears in the back that chimneys exist, which would mean likely that this was a city of wealth, as peasants could not afford houses with chimneys at that time. The architecture in the Olor region looks quite similar to a market in Goa, India, which had been controlled by Portugal since 1510. Now side recto. As you can see, the left side is blank except for the room lines. There are many islands throughout the southern area on the east side, and it's likely from the tales of Marco Polo, who stated that off the coast of China were, quote, 7,448 islands, the majority of which are uninhabited, end quote. So now we do the overall assessment for the recto side. First, the cartouche. Translated, this says, Islands of the Chinese. On these isles, they mine gold and silver with great energy. And besides the copious amounts of wheat and other fruits, there's a list of spices that are grown, and then and all sorts of aromatics grow, and in general, a king rules over each one. Of course, that is not what Marco Polo said. In this region, you'll find Portugal's flag 6 times, showing great control over the area, in my opinion, and most notably the Moluccas Islands, which are the Spice Islands. There's the horizontal delineating lines again, which are Ptolemy's climates, the black lines, with 2 above and 2 below the equator, and the equator is in red. Along the right side of the map, we see that there are latitudes ranging from 23 degrees south through the equator to 23 degrees north. This is equivalent to, of course, 46 degrees of latitude, which is almost exactly how much is on the reverse side, which tracks a total of 47 degrees latitude. As you can see, the land traverses the entire east side of the map, and there's no ending to it, so we have no idea how far south it goes. There's a lot of stippling and cross marks around many of the Spice Islands, especially on the east side of the islands, but interestingly, there is no stippling or cross marks along the eastern coast. To stipple or not to stipple? That is the question. This is a close-up of the crosses and stippling just to the east of the Spice Islands. Now, in pre-1800 maps, cartographers used stippling to indicate, first, shallow banks if the stippling is continuous, which is what I see here, or dangerous curves when the stippling forms a curve. I'm not sure if any of that is present here. You can also see a bunch of crosses, which indicate dangerous rocks. My conclusion from this is that it's a very dangerous place to try and navigate without proper charts, like this one. Now, I started to look at the frontispiece, which is the title page of the Miller Atlas, image 1, and I found something unusual. At the far right, in the center, it's the area of China that has a landmass which attaches to Antarctica and connects with the Brazil over on the west side. At that point in time, it was a minority opinion that the oceans were surrounded by land, and King Manuel's cartographers likely had this information. The shape of the China Seas here and on the atlas map that we've been looking at are similar, and I wonder if they just simply copied this shape from Ptolemy's geography. So here we have an image of Ptolemy's map of the world, and it includes the Magnus Sinus, and that is the China South Seas. And it appears that if you look within that rectangle, the Magnus Sinus is the same shape here as it is in the atlas. Also, the landmass from China goes to Antarctica and meets up with Brazil. Those things check out with the maps we've been looking at. However, Ptolemy's Magnus Sinus looks like it is set at different latitudes. So let's get a closer look at the Magnus Sinus. The Miller Atlas's Magnus Sinus versus Ptolemy's. There's still something unusual going on. I have lined up the equators, and the tops of the map are lined up as well. The northern border of Ptolemy's map is at latitude 18 degrees north, and the Miller Atlas is 47 degrees north. There's not so many islands in Ptolemy's map, and the atlas should be more accurate than Ptolemy's map, so let us compare the atlas map with reality. The Miller Atlas's Magnus Sinus versus reality. There's still something unusual. It appears that the South China Seas are shaped differently here than in the Atlas map. Also, as I'm sure that everyone is aware, there is no land bridge from China to Brazil via Antarctica. In fact, I cannot find any similarities between reality and the Atlas maps. I say so much for Portuguese superiority, except that it might be because the maps we have been looking at were meant to be a pretty gift with no valuable knowledge. After all, maps are state secrets at this time, and Portugal probably did not want anyone knowing how to get to and navigate around the islands in the South China Seas. So it might be just that the maps in the Miller Atlas, specifically those of the South China Seas, are simply beautiful multicolored drawings with a great imagination. The Miller Atlas's Magnus Sinus versus reality, part 2. You can see that the equators from the two maps and both tropics of Cancer are lined up. The yellow lines that you see mark national boundaries on the reality map. China is diagonally in the wrong location on the Atlas map. Half of reality China is in the Atlas China Sea. Almost all of the Atlas China seems to be in the Bay of Bengal. However, the location of the Spice Islands seems to be fairly accurate as it goes below this map onto the Atlas map's recto side. What is going on? That the maps we have been looking at, that, quote, it is a work of pure geographical or geopolitical illustration, which explains why it is so superbly decorated and painted. Although, perhaps the most beautiful chart in the entire Atlas Miller, yet it is simultaneously the falsest. But it is so pretty. It's possible that this was purposely designed without a legend or explanatory phrases so that the observers could be fascinated by the drawing alone and thus reflect on the meaning of the picture without being distracted by facts. Such maps are created as works of art to be appreciated for their aesthetic qualities, so writing on it would spoil the picture. So maybe it was intended for a royal audience after all. However, it is assumed by experts that the fact that the atlas was left unfinished with pages 20 and 21 yet to be completed, that this is considered definitive proof that Manuel I never intended the map to be sent as a state gift to some European dignitary such as the King of France. Also, this is not a portal-in chart or navigational map. It's far too inaccurate and without necessary explanations or legend or even wind roses. So the object was not to serve practical ends, but instead to convey an idea of the world. And the set of shallows east of the Moluccas, remember all that stippling? Well, that's been described as forming a veritable chastity belt around the much sought-after islands. That was a bit suspicious, no? Remember Magellan? Well, it is the consensus of scholars that this map was made to basically be considered as truth, to be conveyed to Spain's elite in order to discourage Magellan's voyage west. It was thought that eventually someone would smuggle the information of this map out of Portugal and into Spain, and that they would see there really is no way to go east by going west. Eventually, Charles V, again Queen Leonor's brother, would get this information and hopefully would cancel Magellan's voyage, leaving the Spice Islands safely to the Portuguese. Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe could have found that the Spice Islands were actually within Spain's part of the globe. So the question that was asked earlier, what happens if you continue west from Spain? Well, you end up in the east. So who got the maps? Well, someone else. So we are back at the Miller Atlas timeline. And as you can see, in the area circled, the Miller Atlas was given to Queen of France Catherine de' Medici sometime around the year 1565. It appears possible that Lopo Homum's son presented the atlas to Queen Catherine de' Medici upon applying for a job with the French as a cartographer. How do we know? Well, supposition. On the front of the Miller Atlas, one can find the crest of Queen Catherine de' Medici, the one she used only from 1559 to 1589. This crest was, according to experts, obviously painted by a later hand. Lopo Homum's son, André, sought and received a job as cartographer to the King of France in 1565. The summary and conclusion. This work was important. How do we know? Well, much time and expense was had in making and preserving these maps, as well as planning and executing the geostrategic and geopolitical scheme. If Spain could get to the Spice Islands and lay a claim to them, that would have reduced Portugal's worldwide importance and influence to a trickle in comparison, not to mention the fortune given up and given to Portugal's rival. The Portuguese did have a bias in favor of trading with all persons found in the South China Seas, so long as other nations acknowledged Portugal's superiority and that Portugal was entitled to these places. It also seems that knowledge of architectural styles or customs of other lands seemed to be unnecessary to these cartographers, at least for this map. Much of the architecture in these maps seemed to come from Portugal's spheres of influence, such as Morocco, India, and West Africa, and even Spain. So my premise was partially correct. The map was made to be pretty, and it was given to a notable dignitary. Well, you thought we were done. Well, we have an extra feature. I did not want you wondering who got the Spice Islands, in the case that you did not know. The Spice Islands belonged to Portugal. However, Portugal had to pay Spain quite a bit of money to not contest ownership. However, Portugal still made a fortune until the Dutch came along and took it away. And a nice ending for Portugal was that 30 years later, in the 1550s, China allowed Portugal back into their sphere of influence to trade legally. Thank you for watching, and have a great day. Also, what comes next is the bibliography, which you can view in silence, as I have decided not to sing to you